It's the middle of winter in my Colorado garden and nothing is growing. This is a good time to stop, look around, evaluate, and start thinking about the gardening plan for the future. But this is also the time of year that many gardeners stop and think about if they even want to continue gardening. And for new gardeners, they're wondering, is it worth it? Most of what we do in gardening is not free. There are costs involved, and we all have to evaluate whether we think we should proceed. Join me today as I discuss that question. Is gardening worth the cost? Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I've been gardening for more than 30 years. And you might think on the surface that answers the question for me. Why would I do it for so long if it wasn't worth the cost? But every year I evaluate my own gardening plan, and I have to ask myself, is it worth it? Like my greenhouse that I added just a couple years ago. I saved up for this greenhouse for a long time, and it took me years to justify adding it to my garden. And I still go inside and wonder, was it worth it? Well, I think by the end of the video you'll know the answer to that question. And I'm going to look at this from two primary perspectives. Growing our own food, and is it worth it to grow our own food? And then from a second perspective, what we get out of gardening. Is what we put into it worth what we get out of it? I think for most of us, gardening is a solitary activity. And I don't necessarily mean that only one person in the family is doing it, but typically it's one person in the family that's managing the garden. It's doing most of the gardening tasks, and other members of the family or friends might come and help, but it's usually a garden because of a single gardener. And every garden is unique, and every gardener has set up the garden the way they want to do it. And so when we begin by discussing the food aspect, this is a good portion of my vegetable garden, and this is where I grow food for my and my family's diet. I'm the one that gets to choose what goes in the garden. I'm the one that takes care of it. And I'm the one that decides whether we even have a garden. Many, many years ago when I first began gardening here in Colorado, I had a big garden. I started big because I was expecting that the rest of the family would participate. But my kids were teenagers and they had other things they were interested in, and so they didn't participate as much as I would have liked. So it ended up being me, a solitary gardener who was growing everything we ate. The reason I mention that solitary gardener aspect is because when you look at how much food you're going to provide your family, you need to factor in how many people are working in the garden. And if it's just one gardener, you're going to be limited in how much you can grow. Now, I'm pretty experienced, so I can grow a lot, but I'm still not able to grow by myself everything that my family needs. It does make a difference. Now, within the garden space right here, each of these raised beds, I've had wonderful success in the last couple years. In this bed, in the last couple years, I've averaged 40 pounds of squash each year. And between a couple beds back there, each bed averaged about 30 pounds of cucumbers each year. Now, I grow tomatoes throughout my garden, mostly in the bed area over there. And I've been able to harvest hundreds and hundreds of cherry tomatoes and dozens of pounds of tomatoes overall. So when we factor in how much a single person can grow, now we can actually start looking analytically at the math and decide if it's worth it. When I built these raised beds almost 5 years ago, costs were much less than they are now. So I was able to build each of these beds and fill it with quality soil for about $200 per bed. And I recognize that costs have gone up. So as you start doing your own analysis, you have to look at the costs within your local area. How much is it going to cost you to garden? Now, my soil is terrible, so I wasn't able to start gardening in my native ground without a lot of work and a lot of amendments and a lot of time. So I chose the raised beds. You don't have to do raised beds, and this plays into the cost. If you can grow in the ground you already have, then your initial cost is essentially zero. If you need to build a bed, it's going to be much more. For me, I'm using $200 per bed as the factor in determining whether it was mathematically worth gardening. So I suggest you go to your store and look in the produce section to get a general idea of how much you're paying for the produce that you bring home. This is the other side of the equation. How much you're currently paying, and you can draw an equivalent correlation to how much you're harvesting. So when I look at these individual beds and I say that I've harvested 40 pounds of squash or 30 pounds of cucumbers, overall, I figure that each year that I'm growing something, I'm able to harvest about $100 worth of produce that I don't have to buy from the store. And this is the kind of analysis that many people will make before they begin gardening. They'll watch a video like this and they'll see that I spent $200. Today it's going to be much more than that. And an experienced gardener can only harvest about $100 worth of produce per bed. It's not going to be profitable until the third year of gardening. I'm going to spend so much money and it's going to take so long for me to get that money back. I don't think it's worth it. And that is valid reasoning. But the way I look at it, because I enjoy gardening, is sure, it takes 3 years for me to get my initial investment back, but every year after that is complete profit. After that third year, if I harvest $100 worth of garlic in this bed, well, that's $100 that I didn't have to spend, $100 that I've saved because I grew it myself. As you do your own analysis, your numbers are going to be different. If you have naturally good soil, well, then the cost is much lower than what I spend. If you live in a region where the lumber and the soil is more expensive, then you need to take that into consideration. I live in an area that has pretty good prices for produce, particularly during the summer months. If you live in an area where produce is much more expensive, you might be able to recoup your costs in the first year or maybe the second year. As you look at growing food and how much you're paying for food, now you can start looking at gardening as an investment, a way to save money and get the food that your family needs without having to pay somebody else for it. I think that most people who are serious about growing their own food recognize that it is a long-term proposition. It's going to cost money up front, and it's going to take a while before they get that money back. But maybe more importantly, when you grow your own food, you know where it came from. You knew how it was grown. It's not being imported from some other country just so you can go to the store and buy it. You know whether you've used pesticides or herbicides or any type of chemicals on your garden. You don't have to guess like many of us do when we go and buy produce at the store. And so we have to factor that in as well. Is gardening worth the cost that we think of as far as the health of our family is concerned. And maybe to look at it a different way, is it worth buying the produce in the store that our family is going to eat? I like the idea of growing organically, knowing the source of my food, and enjoying it in my kitchen. And that leads us to the next phase of whether gardening is worth it. It's the enjoyment aspect. I enjoy eating good food, I enjoy growing my own food, and more importantly, I enjoy being a gardener. On a cold, snowy day like this, I can come into my greenhouse and I can pick a leaf of kale and eat it. And it's delicious. It's sweeter than any kale that you can find in the supermarket. Now, how much am I growing? A couple dollars worth of harvest. It would be more worthwhile for me to go to the store to buy lettuce and kale than to put up a greenhouse to grow it. But this is the beginning of February, and I can come outside and be in a nice warm environment and eat a piece of kale. You can't put a cost on that. This is the enjoyment aspect that I look at my greenhouse and think, yes, it was worth it. I had beautiful black cherry tomatoes growing in this greenhouse after I got the first frost of fall. Well, did I grow enough cherry tomatoes to justify the cost of this greenhouse? Not if you look at it purely mathematically. But eating a cherry tomato in November in Colorado, you can't put a cost on that. It's the enjoyment of it that makes it worthwhile, at least to a gardener like me. There are so many aspects of gardening that you just can't put a cost on. You can't say that, well, it cost me $200 to do this bed. Now I've gotten $200 worth of enjoyment. I think enjoyment shouldn't have a price on it. This bed right here is where I grow pumpkins. I don't grow pumpkins because it's my favorite plant to grow. I grow pumpkins because my granddaughters will come to the garden and choose the pumpkins they're going to decorate for Halloween. The cost savings, $20 or $30 that they might spend if they go to the store and buy the pumpkins. But the satisfaction and the memories that we create, both with the granddaughters and with me, every Halloween, you can't put a price on that. It's invaluable having that interaction for me with kids in the garden and seeing the excitement on their faces. I love getting my family out in the garden at every opportunity. They don't live with me anymore, so every visit is special. And every visit has time in the garden at each time of year. When my son and his family visited in December, we were making snowmen in the garden. Last year, my newest granddaughter from Oregon visited, and we came out to the garden and wandered through it. She won't remember it, she's too young, but I remember it. And it's one of those things that is always going to be locked in my memory. No one can put a price on that. Last summer, Hogan and Maias, two dudes who are traveling across the entire United States on foot, contacted me. They were coming through Colorado and they wanted to visit my garden. So we spent the day walking through the garden. Now, I'm an old guy in the garden, and these are two young dudes who know nothing about gardening. It was a fantastic afternoon. I fixed them lunch with what I was growing. It blew their minds. It blew my mind that it blew their minds because they'd never been exposed to harvesting their own food and then eating it immediately. You can't put a price on that. It was fantastic. I remember it to this day, and I will always remember it. Strangers who left as friends because they shared some garden time. I could go on and on with many, many stories that I've accumulated over the years that are similar. Making new friends because of gardening. And when I look at it, I don't even think about how much each of these beds cost when I'm sharing it with my granddaughters or a new friend. None of that matters. It's the time that we're able to spend together, me and another human being who are bonding in the garden. So I think it's pretty obvious if I were to ask myself, is it worth it? Well, of course it's worth it. And as you do that analysis for yourself, please bring into the equation, what do you get from it? Are you making friends? Are you enjoying it? Is it something you like sharing with others because it's so enjoyable? It certainly is for me. So every dollar I spend in a bed or on a greenhouse or with any other aspect of gardening, it's going to pay me dividends over and over again in the upcoming years because of that aspect. I don't keep my garden to myself. I share it with you. I share it with anyone who wants to come to my garden. That's an important aspect of gardening. We need to share it. We need to share ourselves, and it makes us richer in the process. So when you look at whether it's worth the cost, are you richer because you became a gardener? And I think most of us can say yes. And that cost is what has made us so rich, so wealthy in our lives, because we're gardeners. Now, you may have noticed that this is my 500th video. Many years ago, one of my viewers asked me to start numbering my videos so that he could make sure that he watched all of them in sequence. And so in the description below, you'll see that this is video number 500. I've been doing this for many years. I anticipate doing it for many more years. And this subject of whether gardening is worth the cost is very special to me. And that's why I wanted it to be the subject of this 500th video. I hope you can look at yourself as a gardener and not question the cost and whether you're going to do it again or whether you're going to start. Do it. Become a gardener, and most importantly, enjoy it, because that's what it's all about. The food, the savings, the budget, that's just extra. It's a bonus. It's what we make of gardening that makes it so special. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.